Hey everybody, and welcome to the podcast. I'm Steven.
I'm Daniel.
And today we're going to continue our first 500 years series. Quick note, please remember to subscribe to the channel if you support the ministry that we're doing here and you support the project of the first 500 year series and you've been benefiting from this content. Please subscribe to the channel and support us.
Yeah, and also click that bell so that you get notified when there's a new episode that drops.
Excellent. So today we're going to be talking about something I think that hits at kind of the heart of our channel so far in our series. Anyone who's been following us knows that we've spent a lot of time talking about the quote-unquote Jewish roots of Christianity. In fact, our first episode started with the Judaisms of Jesus. And we talked about how Jesus, in a way, kind of sums up in himself all of these various strands.
All the disparate groups in Judaism, yeah.
Yeah, of Judean religion, and therefore was able to attract many followers from each one of these strands of Judaism or these sects of Judaism. But because he was also different than all of them, he was able to push away many who were in each of those sects. So he really is, even as prophecy said, this cornerstone figure that you either stumble over or you build yourself on top of. So as we move from Jesus' ministry into the apostolic ministry, we have this first controversy of the church, which was over circumcision and how Jewish
do you have to be in order to be a follower of Jesus?
To be a Christian, yeah. And so that's a legacy of even the apostles themselves, sort of this tension that is there between the former religion and religion on the other side of Jesus and what this is supposed to look like. And so you have these Jewish Christian communities in Judea, but then out in the diaspora you have these Gentile heavy communities. So you have an internal tension in the first century in Christianity that eventually gets settled by the early second century. Now what we're looking at is beyond the borders of the church, looking at her sister religion, which we're going to call rabbinical Judaism, right?
Yeah, and you can't tell the story of the church in the second century without talking about this body of scholarship, which we refer to as the parting of the ways.
Yeah.
And the parting of the ways scholarship is just that. It's telling the story of the separation between rabbinic Judaism and Christianity. And there's a reason we're putting an adjective in front of Judaism there. A lot of times I think the tendency is to see Judaism as the mother and Christianity as the daughter. That Christianity comes out of Judaism, and then Judaism just kind of continues, and then Christianity goes off on its own way. That's not the correct way to look at it. The more correct way to look at it is to think of rabbinic Judaism as Judaism moves into the second century. You have two different bodies taking over: rabbinic Judaism and then Christianity. And those are two forms of Judaism that begin to separate from each other. So what you really have is not a mother-daughter situation, but a sister situation, or estranged sisters. More and more as you move from the second, third, fourth into the fifth and sixth centuries, estranged sisters.
Yeah, and we had mentioned in a previous episode how like Essene religion, Essene Judaism was focused on the horror that was this temple. Well, again, once that temple is destroyed in 70 AD, there's really not that much to go on at that point,
Well,
and you also have with the Sadducees, the whole of their life was the temple cult. So that's why you sort of maybe see the fiddling away of those two, but there's a lot of other reasons why.
But see, we're talking about little separations between these two, but none of those things that you just mentioned ever caused the Sadducees or the Qumranites to be considered outside of Judaism.
Right, yeah.
So the question is then, if we're going to talk about in this episode what begins to separate the rabbis from the Jesus believers, we have to understand and just go over very quickly what brought them together.
Okay. So let's start with points of intersection in all sects of Second Temple Judaism.
So all Jews obviously confess the one God of Israel.
Yeah.
Okay. The God revealed to Abraham and the patriarchs. They believed that they were the elect people. They embraced a Judean identity. They obeyed the Torah, and they reverenced the Jerusalem temple, the cult.
And that's everybody. Yeah.
So, but you ask yourself, okay, so if that's what bound the Judaisms together in the first century, where did the Jesus believers fit into that? And the answer is all of those.
Yeah.
the Jesus believers confessed the one God of Israel. They believed they were the promised elect people of God. They embraced Judean identity. We went through James the Just, right? They obeyed the Torah.
Yeah.
The first Jewish believers were obeying the Torah. And they reverenced the temple cult. They went up daily, it says, to the temple. We went over all that.
Yeah.
So you can't exclude the Jesus believers from Judaism.
And even in the circumcision controversy, the resolution for Gentiles was not, you don't have to obey the law. Don't read it that way, Acts 15. What was really being done is, you're like the proselytes, for Judaism. You guys are also supposed to follow certain aspects of the law. Even if it's not circumcision, you definitely have to abstain from sexual immorality. So you have to observe the Jewish sexual code. You have to abstain from things strangled in blood and all that kind of stuff. So there were basic requirements still, even for Gentiles.
Yep, absolutely. And an important point that's sometimes missed, recall how other Jews saw the Christians. So again, Christian is not a term that the Jesus believers used for themselves. It's an outside term that comes from Antioch. Probably the pagans labeled the Christians Christians.
Yeah.
But the Jews saw them as a sect, literally that word, a sect. You see in the book of Acts, they're called the sect, or they're called the sect of the Nazarenes, obviously after Jesus of Nazareth. They follow the Nazarene. But they're a sect, and that's important because in our modern lingo, I think we think that sect has negative connotations to it.
Yeah.
Okay. Almost like the word cult. We get that word wrong. Cult's a positive term, but we think it's a negative term. It has those connotations. Anyway, with sect, it's important that the early believers were called a sect because Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, he calls the Sadducees a sect. He calls the Pharisees a sect. He calls the Essenes a sect. Again, nothing in that early Christian gospel, nothing in the early kerygma could cause the church to be outside the realm of what was considered Jewish or Judean. And that's the important point. And it falls in those major 5 things that we've outlined that glued these people together.
Yeah, yeah. And even going up to the temple, they continue. We talked about that. They go up to the temple to pray, so reverence for the temple. So that's all there. So that's common to the house, of faith.
And I would say the other word we've mentioned before is that the believers saw themselves as the way.
Right.
Well, you can imagine an outsider looking at Judaism and saying, okay, I see some differences here, but I see that is probably a way within Judaism, and that's a way within Judaism. The Essenes themselves consider themselves the way. So that even that term is shared among the different sects. Oh, no, we're the way. Oh, no, we're the way. Okay, so there's this live, what we need to get in our minds is that Second Temple Judaism, it was perhaps chaotic, but there was a lot of allowed debate about who God is and who Israel is and where we're going.
Not completely unlike, I would say, like even just modern Protestantism in a way, where it's like in many Protestantism, it's acceptable for there to be many denominations. There's no...
And different theologies.
Yeah, yeah. There's no sense in which, oh, well, then you're not a Christian anymore. Yeah. It's more like, oh, yeah, well, he's a Presbyterian, this is that, but it's all Protestant. You can kind of think of it that way if you need a modern category. But, okay, so that's what's common to all of them. So how about we define then sort of this parting of the ways, like the initial signs of parting between the Christians and this emergent rabbinicism?
Well, I'd want to first go through things that we think are parting.
Yeah.
So a lot of times people will point to something like the crucifixion. Did the Judeans really expect their Messiah to be crucified? Isn't that something that would have separated the Christians out as, okay, that's not Judaism?
Yeah.
Okay. What's interesting about that is, St. Paul in his letters, he mentions a lot of the debates that he has with his fellow Judeans, okay? But anytime he mentions the crucifixion, he doesn't use combative words. The famous line from St. Paul is that the crucifixion was a stumbling block to the Judeans, to his fellow Jews. Now, that's not a word you use if the Jews are seeing it as something that pushes you completely outside of the realm, outside the scope, beyond the pale of being Jewish. Yeah. A stumbling block is more of a debative word. That, okay, I hear you, Paul, but I can't believe that. I can't get there, So that's important to hold on to that, I think. So it's not something they put a wall up. It's something they can stumble over. according to St. Paul. So that can be debated, crucifixion. And why is that? Well, it's because of things like Isaiah 53, the suffering servant. Wisdom chapter 5, it says, a righteous one through suffering will be exalted. Yeah. Wisdom chapter 5, I think 5, something like that. But there's all this Second Temple literature that is pushing toward kind of a representative of Israel who would suffer. Yeah. And so there are a lot of ties to, okay, maybe the Messiah will suffer. So crucifixion, how horrible it was, a dying Messiah, crucified Messiah, wasn't completely beyond the pale.
I think what was a stumbling block, I mean, this is just pure conjecture, but I think probably not total conjecture, because even in the dialogue with Trypho in the mid-2nd century with St. Justin Martyr and his dialogue with a Jew named Trypho, Trypho is constantly going back at him and saying, yeah, but he hung on a tree. Okay, so that's proof that God cursed him. So I think it's actually the manner of death. I don't think they may not have had a total problem right off the bat, like you're saying, with a Messiah who comes and suffers and dies even. I think they might have been, okay, well, what do you mean? And they would have wanted to hear more. I think it's when you say that he was hung on a tree, that to the Jewish ears, or to their ears, they're hearing cursed is the one who hangs on a tree from the Torah. So it was maybe the manner of death for them that was the proof.
And again, when the Christians begin to explain the crucifixion as, it is a curse. He took on the curse.
Right.
Now he becomes an atonement. Yeah. And when you start talking about atonement, that too could be an initial sign of parting. Because, of course, the Judeans are saying, well, we have the atonement at the temple. Yeah. We have the atoning sacrifices in Yom Kippur. So that could lead down that path as well. But everything you've just said is, the point is that, it's a debate.
It is.
And they're continuing to have that debate within the synagogues. St. Paul went from synagogue to synagogue, and he found believers there.
Well, and think of it this way. I mean, if the Essenes can get away with still being considered a part of Israel by saying that temple is a whore.
Is a whore, and they literally moved outside of Jerusalem,
right, to get out of it.
Established a separate cult.
Yeah.
And still be considered within the realm, within the scope of Judaism, yes.
Yeah, then it's not crazy to imagine that the Way would have still been considered a part of Israel, even if they had a crucified Messiah.
Absolutely. Yeah. The second thing sometimes is Messiah itself. The idea of Messiah, that Jesus was Messiah, and that kind of separates out the believers from the rest of Judaism. We're not quite sure what the Sadducees believed about a Messiah. And we're pretty sure that most Judeans believe that the Messiah was going to be a political figure. So yes, that could be another stumbling block. Okay, Jesus came and he died. He was supposed to overthrow the Romans or something. Yeah. So what ended up happening with that? Yeah. But again, the concept of Messiah is obviously thoroughly Jewish. The anointed one, the king who is to come. So that's not something off the bat that again would push the believers.
They both believe that there's a Messiah coming. So the Messianism is not unique to the Christians, right. In other words. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And especially in the first century, there's all kinds of groups. And especially if you think even into the 2nd century. So we have the second Jewish revolt in the early 2nd century, in the 130s, led by Bar Kokhba, and he is a Messianic figure. Yeah. We can tell that from the archaeology, from the coins. He's portrayed as the star, as a Messiah who has come to overthrow the Romans. And so many Judeans went after his cause. So the concept of following after somebody as a Messiah doesn't necessarily exclude you. Here's the other reason why that doesn't necessarily exclude you. Even if the other Judeans were saying, well, yeah, but Jesus died and he's not here anymore and he didn't overthrow the Romans, there's concepts in Second Temple Judaism that point to the idea of two Messiahs. Yeah. Okay? So even if that was something that could separate, still other Jews were thinking, okay, yeah, so Jesus was one Messiah maybe, but who's the next?
Who's the next one? Yeah.
Again, it's that kind of atmosphere.
Exactly.
The other major thing that could perhaps be seen as a sign of parting in the 1st century would be, of course, the early cultic veneration of Jesus himself. Yeah. That the believers in Jesus were worshiping him, cultically venerating him. But even there, you had groups like the Qumranites, the Essenes, and you read some of their literature, some of the Dead Sea Scrolls that we have found, and we've covered that before. You have things like the glorification of heavenly figures that are exalted and sit at the right hand of the Father. Yeah. there are great speculations among the Essenes about who the Messiah might be. Mm-hmm. And you either get a divinized human, right, or an angel who becomes human.
Yeah.
Okay, so either a human that becomes divine or a divine angel that becomes human.
Yeah.
Both of those concepts can be shown to be speculations among the Essenes.
Right. Right. And even in the Old Testament texts, we have so many instances where the king himself, it's like commanded, like bow down and worship the king.
Yeah,
You're talking
King
about the king of Israel.
In Chronicles.
So even like Davidic king worship was not totally out of bounds.
Yeah. At least veneration.
Right.
Down
Well, yeah, worship in the true sense of the word, which is worthship, to ascribe worth to someone, to bow down and to venerate.
So again, an exalted heavenly figure is not beyond the scope of what you consider Judaism. So yes, those could be initial signs of parting, but not necessarily. And that's all first century stuff.
Yeah. So the point of going through that is to say that if someone, was going to tell, like, I guess the Reader's Digest version of the history, they would say, oh, well, these Christians, they believe that, that
Jesus was a second God.
Jesus was a second God. The reason why, Judaism continued to be what it was and Christianity went off was because they declared this man to be the Messiah, even though he was crucified. And it's like, that's a no-go for, and when you really get beyond the Reader's Digest version, you get into the actual text, especially texts that we've uncovered, like you said, at Qumran and so on. We see that actually what the Christians are saying is pretty typical. I mean, it's pretty normal.
It's within the scope of Jewish speculation about the concepts of God.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's even passages in Scripture where the Pharisees are not asking Jesus, like, they're not saying to Jesus, like, you make yourself out to be the Son of God. They're like, you make yourself out to be the Son of God. Like, meaning, like, they
knew.
also knew.
So let me see if I can. That's a good verse in Luke to actually read. I know it's the top left of my page, so I have to keep looking at the top
page
left.
Memory.
Here we are, top left. This is Luke chapter 20.
Right where you left it.
Yeah, Luke chapter 22. Jesus before the Sanhedrin. Okay, so when day came, the council of elders of the people met, both chief priests and scribes. And notice how in the Gospels it always says the chief priests. Remember when we said Caiaphas kind of had a family vendetta or something against Jesus and his followers?
Yeah.
It's not. There's many priests who joined the Christian movement. Anyway, when day came, the council of elders of the people met, both chief priests and scribes, and they brought him before the Sanhedrin. They said, "If you are the Messiah, tell us." But he replied to them, "If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I question, you will not respond. But from this time on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." End quote. They all asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" He replied to them, "You say that I am." Then they said, "What further need we have for testimony? We have heard it from his own mouth."
Right.
Jesus and the Sanhedrin never brought up the term Son of God. When Jesus was speaking, when they were speaking, he said Son of Man, who sits at the right hand of the Father, in reference to probably something like Daniel 7, where this heavenly figure shows up on the throne at the right hand of the Father,
right.
apparently at the right hand of the Ancient of Days.
Right.
So that Son of Man terminology is very Jewish terminology. And then they know what he's saying. He said, so
Son of God.
So you think you're the Son of God then. So in other words, to your point, the Sanhedrin, the chief priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they all know that they're waiting for the Son of God.
Yes. Yeah.
But they just don't think it's Jesus.
They just don't think it's him.
Right.
And they think it's blasphemy that he's claiming to be that.
Right.
It's a very important distinction. I think it's very easy to read the scriptures and to come away saying,
thank you for reminding me of that verse.
But to walk away and say, like, oh my goodness, Jesus is claiming to be the Son of God, and they just can't take it. Yeah. It's like, no, he's claiming to be something that they themselves are waiting for, but they're like, well, you're clearly not him though. So we've heard it from your own mouth.
Yeah. So what we're saying is then in general that the traditional story wanted to say that Judaism begins, or Christianity, Jesus believers begin to separate from the Judeans in the first century, and they become ways that are inevitably separate, right? We're saying that's not, we have to nuance that.
Yeah.
What we would say is that the real separations begin in the second century.
Right.
Okay, there's other initial signs of separation that we can go through. So the traditional story is generally correct, but it shows this kind of tendency that follows the church fathers and that what we call supersessionism, that the church replaces ancient Israel. And so theologically, when scholars were looking back and studying historically the first century and second century, they were saying, well, if Christianity is the church and the church replaces Israel, they must have separated very early on. It must have been a separation. But since the discovery of Qumran, since the discovery of the text of Ugaritic texts, the Canaanite texts, we've come to understand that first century Judaism, as we have been explaining, is so diverse and a larger umbrella than we ever thought.
Right. Okay. So instead of those three, the crucifixion, Messianism, and Messiah being exalted to the right hand, apart from those three, we then have to say, okay, well, there has to be at least seeds in the first that are sown in the first century that will eventually blossom in the second century into a parting of ways between the emergent rabbinicism and this Christian movement. So let's maybe just say, what are those? What are those first century kind of seeds that are ready to germinate by the time you get to the end of the second century and into the...
So the first major one would be almost practical, the influx of Gentiles.
Yeah.
So for the first, we could assume for the first at least 2-3 decades of the Jesus movement, the majority of the followers were probably Jewish. As you move into the 50s, 60s, 70s, in some areas, now it's going to be majority Gentile. So if you look at the book of Romans, chapter 16, where Paul's listing a bunch of names, it seems as if only about 30% of those people who are listed are Jewish. So it's 70-30. In Rome, in the late 50s.
Yeah.
In other places, it's more heavily Jewish, okay? So the influx of Gentiles challenges ethnic identity. So we said one of the things that ties all the Jews together in this scope of Second Temple Judaism is Judean identity. But if now your congregations towards the end of the first century are becoming majority Gentile, what does that do to your Judean identity? Okay, it's going to change the face of the church naturally.
Yeah.
And now a synagogue is less likely to tolerate an influx of all these Gentiles coming into their synagogues, whereas before, if you had a couple of Jesus believers still attending synagogue, still observing Sabbath, okay, whatever.
Yeah.
We can deal with it. But not so if there's an influx of Gentiles. So that one tenet that bound them together is being challenged now because all these Gentiles are coming into the church.
Yeah. Yeah. The second thing, of course, that we've already mentioned is circumcision. You know, just this idea that these Gentiles that are coming in don't need to be circumcised.
Yeah.
You know.
And again, that's a mixed bag too.
Yeah, because they also, in some instances, would not, and they were fine with these Gentiles who sort of be Klingons to the synagogue.
Right, and there are some famous Jews in history that we know that weren't actually circumcised.
Yeah.
But
you know what? It's more than that. It's a different attitude towards circumcision that allows for decisions like that. Okay, but behind that then is this idea that circumcision doesn't make you righteous, save you from the coming judgment, or any of these kinds of things. Like the Christians are going to focus on a different kind of circumcision made without hands. Namely, they're locating it a lot in baptism.
And again, this is one of the points: is that at the same time that circumcision is, which one is it, chicken or the egg? Circumcision is becoming more important as a Judean identity.
Yeah.
Over and against the influx of Gentiles to Christianity. Okay, that's why we're talking about sisters here. Okay, these two sisters are going to develop knocking against each other too. Okay, like a jagged rock that's falling from a mountain smooths over time. These rabbinic Judaism that comes up out of the Pharisees and these Jesus believers are coming up out of the first century, they're going at each other, they're debating with each other as they go along, and they're shaping each other into smoother and smoother rocks and moving further.
And we can't forget that in the first century, at the head of a lot of these debates is actually going to be Christians. Again, I hate even using the word Christians because it has connotations, but Jesus believers, Jesus followers who are Pharisees, who are temple priests,
Yeah.
who have become believers in Jesus.
And we'll give you some texts that show proof of that. But.
Yeah, so they're debating with their fellow Pharisees, their fellow temple priests.
You don't stop being a priest just because you started believing in Jesus.
Right.
The priesthood is ethnic. It's handed down through these families. Mm-hmm. You're a priest, okay? Especially now that you're a believer in Jesus. Now you're doubly a priest of Melchizedek.
Yes.
So the priesthood doesn't go away with the Jews, which is why the book of Acts tells us that many priests joined the movement.
Right. So then you also have in the first century two different reactions to the destruction of the temple, right?
Yeah.
And the Jewish war in general, the Jewish revolt that takes place.
So recall the revolt starts in 66. Jerusalem is destroyed. The temple is destroyed in 70. Now, tradition holds that the Christians fled to Pella. I think we've mentioned that in other previous episodes. The Jesus believers flee the city by tradition. What's that going to do to their standing among other Jews who stayed and fought?
Right.
It's going to make them question your loyalty to the temple, isn't it?
Of course.
So that's another one of those tenets that glued Judean identity, Judeans together, was devotion and zeal for the Lord's house will consume me. Everybody else has zeal, but you Jesus believers don't seem to have the zeal that you should have if you are truly Jewish.
Which has been a stigma for them since Christ. I mean, one of the accusations they bring to him is that he speaks blasphemies against this holy place. Mm-hmm. They say the same thing about Stephen. It's like he speaks blasphemies about the temple. So that there's at least this stigma about Christians that they're sort of wishy-washy on temple.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, though, because why was Stephen killed? Because it seems that Stephen, in his theology, went a little beyond in his attack on the temple.
Yeah.
James wouldn't have gone that far.
Right.
So Stephen is killed. So again, persecution of Christians doesn't mean they were outside the scope of Judaism.
Right.
It just means that Stephen went a little beyond what they were willing to tolerate. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
The same thing goes for James, actually, by the way. Why was James killed? Well, the family of the high priest killed him. But then what happened? The elders got together and said, you wrongly killed him. Mm-hmm. And they were mad about it, and they removed the high priest. So even the Jewish non-Christians respected James well into the 60s in the first century. Mm-hmm. Okay?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, you have this flight to Pella, which kind of makes the Christian movement in and around Jerusalem at least suspicious, because we know that even many Essenes took up arms against Rome.
And they too suffered for it.
So think about that. You have the Essenes who've been railing against this temple the whole time. When push comes to shove, they
defend the homeland.
They defend the homeland. They defend their people.
It seems like the Jesus believers. The only pushback I would say against that, the flight to Pella tradition is pretty strong in literary evidence of the 3rd and 4th century, but archaeology is mixed on it. They've excavated Pella. There's not a lot of obvious Christian presence there. Mm-hmm. Now that could be for a number of reasons, but the other thing to think about, the other pushback is the bishop lists. So we're told that the Christians had to flee Jerusalem, but we also have the early bishop lists of the Jerusalem church all the way into the 2nd century, and the lists are clearly Jewish names. Mm-hmm. So a Jewish bishopric continued ethnically. Judean bishopric continued sometime into the 2nd century, leading up to the Bar Kokhba revolt. So yes, this is an initial sign of separation, but not yet. Yeah. Again, it's a not yet kind of thing. The real destruction was the revolt with Bar Kokhba.
Yeah.
That's when the Romans came in and leveled everybody and kicked everybody out. Right. So that's a little pushback to this.
Yeah. The fourth thing that kind of plants some seeds is taxation policy, right? So why don't you elaborate on that a little bit?
So it's called the fiscus judaicus. It's a tax. So, the Romans, they love
take a sip. You picked up your cup. Yeah, take that sip.
The Romans like to
that was going to be a good one.
The Romans like to be ironic. They like to stick it to people, which is why they crucified people, okay? Mm-hmm. Or like putting up on Jesus' cross, King of the Jews, right? Mocking him. Yeah. They love to mock people. So what happens is the Jews, the diaspora Jews and all the Jews would give 2 drachma, I think it was, a year to the temple. to upkeep the temple, to pay the priest, all that stuff, to keep the sacrificial system going. So no matter where you were in the Mediterranean, you would go to your local synagogue, register, pay your tax to the temple.
Yeah.
Well, the Romans came and they destroyed the temple. And they said, wait a minute, though. These Jews have money that they've been paying to this temple. So guess what we're going to do? We're going to tax the Jews. We're going to tax the Judeans, and that tax is going to go to build the temple of Jupiter. So they transfer the tax to a pagan temple. And now all the Jews, ethnic Jews, have to pay the tax. So you can imagine a lot of Judean Christians wanting to separate themselves from their ethnic bounds and separate themselves from the synagogues. Okay. But even if they didn't, so Emperor Vespasian was the one who put in the tax initially. Emperor Nerva, in the late 1st century, 96 or so, reforms the tax, and he says, no, the tax is going to be taxed to people who continue the ancestral customs of the Jews. So really now the Jesus believers who are Jewish ethnically, now they have a reason to say, we don't need to be a part of that.
We
anymore.
don't keep the new moons.
Right. If I have to keep away from sacrificed meats, I'm certainly not going to give a tax if I don't have to a pagan temple.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So again, that's a small reason why Judean Christians are going to start to maybe move away from synagogues.
Right.
And you get evidence of that in the 90s. The Gospel of John is great evidence. Revelation is great evidence for Jewish Christians being kicked out of the synagogues. And we start to see that towards the late 1st century.
Segue. So that's point number 5, which is the Birkat Hamanim, which is the condemnation of heretics, that the text that we see arise out of the synagogues. We have mention of it, too, in Christian sources, namely, again, that source, Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, where he actually mentions that, you curse in your synagogues those who believe in Christ. So that condemnation starts to arise around this time, right?
Yeah. So traditional scholarship says so. The Birkat Hamanim is part of the 18 benedictions, the 18 blessings that rabbinic Jews say every day. Okay, 3 times a day, and it's a list of 18 of these things. In the 12th one, Steve, you can read it for us in a second. In the 12th one, there's a condemnation against the menim, and that word literally means sorts, like sorts of people. Okay, but it comes to mean heretics, people we push out of synagogues, basically. And for a long time, the scholars believed that this comes up out of the late 1st century, that this benediction formulated itself under Gamaliel II, which would be the late 1st century. There are other scholars who would argue that actually, no, it's Gamaliel I, Rabbi Gamaliel I, who introduces it to ostracize the Sadducees, actually. But it's carried over, menim, and this curse basically on non-rabbinic Jews. So Steve, read for us the 12th.
All right. So it says, "For the apostates, let there be no hope, and may the kingdom of the arrogant be quickly uprooted in our days, and may the Nazarim and the Minim instantly perish. May they be blotted from the book of the living, and not be written with the righteous. Blessed are you, O Lord, humbler of the arrogant."
Okay, so you could point to this and say, okay, this is beginning to be said over and over and over by the descendants of the Pharisees, the rabbinic Jews, and their synagogue system. Okay, so this is a point of separation. They're pushing out people who don't agree with them on certain things. That probably included the Christians, but included a lot of other folks too, because menim is just a general term. They're never really specific. However, some will point out that benediction reads like a family feud. They're saying, Lord, please blot them out of the book of life, meaning that they're in the book of life.
They're in it, yeah.
But we want you to blot them out of the book of life. So it's more like a debating family feud that's going on.
And they're saying to humble the arrogant. They're saying that they're arrogant.
Yeah. They're not saying they hold some specific heresy, but they're insolent. That we don't like their attitude.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
they don't heed the elders. Yeah.
So take the inheritance away from them, basically.
Right.
So again, yes, it's a separation, but it's also kind of showing their hand.
Yeah. Separation implies that there's a previous unity. So
the other word there you used, Nazarim.
Yeah.
That part of the benediction has been shown to be later.
Yeah.
Because apparently in the manuscript tradition, it appears in different spots in that benediction. So you know that it must have been an addition, and people in different areas added it
Put it in different places.
Right.
Yeah.
That specifically speaks of the Christians, the Nazarenes. So certainly, and scholars will say that's mid to late 2nd century. So you said, St. Justin Martyr says, hey, the Jews in their synagogues, they curse us in their synagogues. Perhaps it was the mid 2nd century when that was put into there, and he knows of it because he's, of course, from Syria.
Yeah. So originally it would have read that, may the arrogant be uprooted in our days, and may the minim instantly perish. But by the 2nd century, you're saying mid 2nd century, they add in this, may the Nazarim and the minim perish.
Yeah. So they're being a little more specific, as in, no, you guys need to
also
beat it.
Right. Yeah. So that's good. We have then already in the late 1st century and the early part of the 2nd century, these seeds that we think are much more fertile for the later parting of the ways to blossom.
Yeah.
But I think, go ahead.
Can we look at, I want to get back to the Bar Kokhba.
Yeah.
Just because this is another, so I think what our listeners should be hearing is that it's not always about theology. It's not churches that separate, it's people groups. Okay. It's stuff that's going on the ground too, politically. Okay. So we mentioned the destruction of the temple in the 70. But again, I'll emphasize Emperor Hadrian, and his suppression of the Jews in the Second Revolt in the 130s. I mean, it's really ethnic cleansing is what takes place. Not only does he come in and conquer Judea again, but he kicks out everyone who is ethnically Jewish from Jerusalem and central Judea, the whole territory. They're no longer allowed even in there. And so that's when you see, okay, well, who's left then? Just the Gentiles. And that's exactly when the Gentile bishops begin to start and carry on a Jerusalem church. So clearly there's outside factors, political factors that are affecting the separation between Christians and their Judean identity.
Yeah, and keeping in mind, too, that if you followed our previous episode about the successors of Peter, this is all happening right around the same time. So you're, like, Jerusalem and Judea is receding in terms of its like heritage, its apostolic heritage, because that's being wiped out by the Romans.
Absolutely.
Not if what the Jews were doing. Well, I keep saying the Jews.
What the Judeans.
What the Judeans were doing to the believers in Jesus.
So we're saying that because Judeos, the word that can be translated Jews, and it is often translated Jews in the New Testament, actually can be translated Judean.
Right.
And I think it's helpful. It's helpful for us because when we hear the word Jew, we automatically have these modern categories of who a Jew is,
right?
And what is Jewishness? Yeah. But we got to break those categories down.
Yeah,
and I think Judean helps us break that down. Yeah. The Jews didn't call themselves Jews,
right?
Okay, and the Christians didn't call themselves Christians until later.
Yeah. So, these members of Israelite religion were but if they didn't do enough damage to the fledgling like Christian movement in the 1st century, well, the Romans really finished the job.
Yeah.
And so Judea is not where the church is looking then, and this is why. So this is also part of that story. I hope that people are able to tie this thread from episode to episode, that's why you have the ascendancy of
other seas
at this time. Yeah. But okay, so let's talk about then the 2nd century, because that's the century we're in.
But can I say something? Because you said
you're killing me, man.
Because you said people are looking to other seas. Well, they're looking to other seas, but they're looking to other people. James is dead again.
Yeah.
Who's alive? Peter's alive.
Yeah.
He's Judean. He carries the Judean tradition, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So now we're going to move into the 2nd century. And let's talk about how some of these seeds really blossom and what that looks like. I think just an overall point is that I think the Christians, the believers in Jesus in the 1st century, set themselves up in a way that even the Essenes never did. They set themselves up to be able to survive without reference to the temple. Like they don't.
Well, the Essenes did, but they were also political.
Yeah.
And so the Romans took care of that one.
Yeah. And ultimately, they were still ethnically tied. Mm-hmm. The Christians, when you have this influx of Gentiles, like we said, the ethnic tie is at least a little weaker to Judean identity. So they set themselves up because littered throughout the New Testament, from Jesus' own words of saying, not one stone of this temple is going to be left upon another. And Jesus saying, tear down this temple, I'll raise it in 3 days. So there's already this concept by the late first century, especially in John's writings and stuff, that Jesus, wherever Jesus is the temple.
That is where the temple is.
And Jesus says, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am in their midst. So Christians are putting this together in their minds, that wherever the Christians are gathered,
Jesus believers,
wherever these Jesus believers are gathered, in their minds, that is the temple. And so the temple, for them, it's not that it doesn't exist. That's actually a mistake. For the Christians, the temple does exist. It's just that temple has been not only fulfilled, but the fulfilled version of that temple and its cult has actually gone out into all the earth. So that everywhere that Christians are meeting, that right there is the instantiation of the new temple. Mm-hmm. The Judeans do not see it that way. They're still very much attached to this temple.
So
right.
Yeah. So the rabbis, the ones who survived the wars, and they have the synagogue system in place. Literally the first writings we have from the rabbis is not until the late 2nd, early 3rd century. It's called the Mishnah. Mm-hmm. Basically, it's a commentary on the laws of Israel. And in the Mishnah, there is great focus on the temple, ironically, from the rabbis. Great focus on Levitical laws, great focus on priests. They even tell us in the Mishnah that there are still groups of priests. Mm-hmm. So the rabbis had a hope, clearly, that the temple would someday return.
Right.
Okay. But they were set up to succeed because the rabbis are studiers. They're book people. Mm-hmm. And the Torah, for them, begins to replace temple cult.
Well, and okay, so you're hitting on my main point then, before we go into this, is that the Christians in the first century had already set themselves up to be okay without a temple. The non-believing Judeans were not as strongly set up for that reality. So the story of the parting of the ways, in a way, of the 2nd century between Judaism, rabbinical Judaism, and Christianity is really a story of not Christians developing a ton, right? Their concept of these things. It's really like, well, what's going on in rabbinical Judaism? What are they developing that is actually separating them more starkly from this Christian movement? It's
what's separating. What are the rabbis saying theologically that's separating from Christians, and what are Christians saying that's separating from rabbis? And what strands of Second Temple Judaism are both of them pulling on to separate?
Exactly. But my point is that, like, there's more of a burden of proof, in a way, quote unquote, for the rabbinics to define themselves because they don't have that temple anymore. Whereas for Christians, they already had defined themselves without that temple, so they're going to continue to develop that thought and flourish in that, and those changes need to be tracked. But my point is that, like, when we think of that mother-daughter relationship, a lot of people assume the mother-daughter relationship of, like, oh, well, Judaism kind of just stayed what it was and Christianity. It's like, no, actually the burden of proof here for the 2nd century is on the rabbinics, because they have to prove that their version of this religion can survive without reference to a temple. I mean, think about it, guys. When you're talking about Second Temple Judaism, you're talking about a religion of sacrifice. You're talking about again, Jerusalem is not a city with a temple. It was a temple with a city. Yeah. Like, everything revolved around that temple.
And even to your point, even Jews that did not live in Judea, Egypt, for example, what did they do? They built their own temple.
They built a temple.
They had a temple in Egypt, Heliopolis.
Altar and sacrifice is ingrained in the DNA of Second Temple Judaism and First Temple Judaism. Yeah. It's like, you can't imagine it without the temple. So now, again, when the temple is gone after 70 AD, you're going to have this period between there and the Bar Kokhba revolt where there's the hope that we'll get that temple back and rebuilt.
And even after that, they'll always hope for it.
But there's something about that Bar Kokhba revolt that really dashes it at least puts so much of a setback on them that they have to pivot in some way or another they have to define themselves in certain ways.
Yeah.
So that's so just keep that in your mind as we go through like the second century blossoming of these parting of the ways. So the first thing that we would bring up is the concept of God is different. Like it starts to change. And we're actually, because this is so important, we're going to do a follow-up episode on this specific thing, because the real question is, was Second Temple or even First Temple Judaism ever really, quote unquote, monotheistic? Was it ever? Which, gets us into like modern debates.
It's a whole other episode, so we'll cover that.
We'll talk about that. Yeah. So we have like the whole idea of strict monotheism. That'll be a means of parting, but we'll talk about it. So the second thing that we want to talk about then is the cult, like we said with the temple. You sort of have like this tension between a tendency to allegorize parts of the temple cult and temple ritual, as opposed to continuing to instantiate those rituals without the temple there.
So let's flesh that out.
So we have like okay, so the Epistle to Barnabas on the Christian side, the letter to the Hebrews even.
Hebrews, Epistle of Barnabas, again, could be a late first century, but mostly a early second century document written by some Christian who maybe has a Jewish ethnic background.
But you see in there this heavy tendency to take all of the temple rituals and symbols of the Old Covenant and to spiritualize them. So like just take like as an example, circumcision. Okay, that's an easy one, where it's like, oh, you stupid, foolish people, you didn't realize that when Moses gave you circumcision, he wasn't even talking about circumcision. He was talking about circumcision of the heart. Like, so that they...
or the one that always stuck out to me was he's talking about the finest flour, the sacrifices of finest flour, saying that there are no more sacrifices of finest flour at all, so he's what we call spiritualizing the whole cult. And it's almost like it's like how Western self-loathe themselves. It's like the letter of Barnabas does that same thing. The letter of Barnabas is very anti-Jewish, even though it's written by probably
a Jew,
an ethnic Jew.
Yeah. I think a great analogy once again for this is Protestantism. Because Protestantism will often see they'll look at Roman Catholicism or Orthodoxy and they'll say like, you guys are just you're stuck in law and ritual and rites and ceremonies. All of that has been spiritualized in Christ. And they'll say like, that's why like the true sacrifice is not a grain offering or this or that. It's the fruit of lips, that give praise to his name.
Praise to God, yeah. And that's exactly what Barnabas would say in the letter.
Exactly.
So that's one strand coming up, this kind of anti-cultic strand. And I think
I would say anti-sacerdotal, I guess we could say.
Anti-sacerdotal, anti-sacrificial strand coming up within Christianity in some way. But I think what you're getting is that the rabbis are going the same way.
Yeah. The rabbis are pretty much doing
the same exact thing as Barnabas.
The same thing.
But politely.
And I would say this. I would say Barnabas represents one strand of the early Christian movement, but not all of it. Because then you have documents like we've already mentioned, like the Didache, where it's like, no, there are offerings. Like there are still offerings going on. And by the time you get to the second century, the late second century, early third century liturgical documents of the church that are finally bubbling up, which means that the ritual goes back to the early second century, you're seeing all kinds of stuff going on when Christians gather together.
The bloodless oblation.
Yeah, all kinds of offerings. People are bringing offerings to the church, like to offer.
Yeah, and offerings to the prophets, first fruits.
Exactly. So yeah, you still have a temple cultic atmosphere in these churches.
So and the view that wins out. This is an important point. The view that wins out within these strands of Christianity is the cultic one. That the church reasserts its cultic identity in the Eucharist. And that is what wins out, and that's obviously the Holy Spirit guiding the church. So yes, you can find anti-sacerdotal spiritualizing of the cult among some early Christian writers, but that's not what ends up winning the day.
Because so the tendency for Christians, as the great church is developing, is that no, there's still a temple cult, it's fulfilled in Christ. You know, what was previously in like these dim types and stuff is now, you know, for us in images and symbols and all these different things. For the rabbinics, you initially had that tendency to sort of maintain a lot of these kind of temple-ish rituals and stuff, but as you move further and further, you know, into the latter half of the 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th, you know, and so on and so forth, rabbinical Judaism is going to go heavy on spiritualizing the cult. That the cult is, you even have, I mean, all the way even to modern times, where like Jews today will even say, you don't even need it. Like, you don't need it because we have Torah. We have prayer. We have these things. And so they've completely moved beyond the need for a cult.
Right. And we're not Jewish scholars, but that's the trend to look at in rabbinic Judaism, is that move from cultic temple to Torah.
Yeah. So I like wrote this down as like one of the questions. Like, can you say that the rabbis would prefer to allegorize the temple cult and maintain a more concretized view of the Messianic promises, while Christians would have a tendency to allegorize the Messianic promises and maintain a more concretized practice?
Okay, so let's flesh that out, because you're saying the Christians are allegorizing the Messianic promises. Why would they need to do that? Because it would seem that a kingdom would need to be established by the Messiah. So the Christians have to read those texts in the Old Testament and say, yeah, that's the second coming.
Right.
And the rabbis are saying, no, that's supposed to be the first coming. That's
but there's also some instances where you have like where Justin's having the dialogue with Trypho, and Trypho says to him, hey man, like Jesus ain't the guy because Elijah didn't come. The last thing that we read in the prophets is that Elijah is going to come and herald the coming of the Messiah. Elijah didn't come. Jesus ain't the Messiah. Done. See, that's a very literal reading of the prophets. Now you move over
Christians
to Christians.
Are on their heels. They say, well, we got to figure that out.
Right. Well, it comes up even in the New Testament where Jesus says, and those of you who have ears to hear, John the Baptist was Elijah. And in fact, that's we talked about this, that John did everything that Elijah does. You know, he dressed like Elijah, acted like Elijah. Yeah. So for Christians, like John was that forerunner. He was that
spiritually,
that herald. Yes, spiritually, but not literally Elijah, you know. Unless you're going to count in the transfiguration, you know. Yeah. So that's interesting, you know. So the lion hasn't lied down with the lamb. What do we do? Well, but the Jew and the Gentile have found peace with one another. So that is the lion and the lamb lying down together. So that's where the Christians are going to go with these messianic promises, at least in Jesus' first coming. And then you get the book of Revelation where it's like, no, Jesus is going to come back and do all those things you're expecting.
And don't think that the Jews stopped believing the Messiah was going to come. That didn't change.
Right.
The rabbinic Jews in the 18 benedictions, in fact, are still calling upon the Davidic kingdom to come and to overthrow the evil forces and the evil kingdom.
So keep your eye on that. Keep your eye on the fact that Christians will take... So you have two things: temple, cult, messianic promises. And both of them agree on these things. For the Christians, the temple cult is a lot more instantiated in the Christian communities all over the world, and they maintain these rituals in a fulfilled way. But the messianic promises, they're going to think, you know, are more like there's... It was
some he fulfilled,
right,
and others
is yet to be fulfilled, right, and even the ones he did fulfill were fulfilled in ways we didn't expect.
Especially remember, because a lot of it later became a heresy, but Chiliasm.
Yes,
many early Christians believed in a millennial kingdom, a 1,000-year reign of Christ. A lot of the early writers did, and so the early writer, you can imagine a lot of early Jesus believers saying to Jews, yeah, he is going to come to establish his kingdom on earth and overthrow the Romans and all that stuff. We just got to wait a second here. Yeah. And you're saying, well, no, he's supposed to do it the first time he came. Yeah. So again, that's a real debatable. There's intermingling going on in that debate, even into the 2nd century.
Yeah. So then the rabbinicism that is emerging is going to take the opposite approach, sort of. We'll take the opposite approach to sort of concretize those messianic promises as a way of arguing against Christians, and spiritualize the cult so as to say, like, well, that's why we can exist without the temple. We don't, we don't need it, right, because of all these different things. So that's how you might look at the modes of departure for these two. So we have also have a departure in the 2nd century on canon. What texts are going to be common to the house when we tell our story? You know.
Yeah, exactly. So the first canon we get is the Muratorian canon out of Rome in the late 2nd century, New Testament canon. And it's
Well, besides Marcion's canon, but
well, I was just going to say, hey, don't jump ahead. I was just going to say that it was probably put together because
of Marcion, right?
We'll get to Marcion. We'll deal with Marcion. But so the Christians are beginning to build a canon. Now, as we move through the 2nd century, there's going to be things that are markers for how the church survives. One of them is canon. Okay, so the canon begins to develop in many areas. It's still different among some churches. Okay, this book's out, this one's in, this one, whatever. But what's important here is we're talking about the Old Testament canon. The Christians are going to adopt a lot of Jewish writings that the rabbinic Jews do not adopt.
Right.
So a lot of the Apocrypha, writings that you would think the rabbinic Jews would keep and promote, they begin to put aside.
Yeah.
So we think of the books that are included in the Catholic Bible, in our Catholic Old Testament, the Apocrypha, or sometimes, or what Protestants would consider Apocrypha.
Yeah.
So books like Sirach, books like Wisdom of Solomon,
Susanna and the Dragon,
Tobit,
Baruch.
right.
Yeah.
There are books that not just Roman Catholics, but Eastern Orthodox, Ethiopian Orthodox, have in their Old Testament canon that never became the rabbinic canon. Okay, and next episode we're going to flesh out some reasons why that is.
Which, by the way, let me just insert here for 1 second. Like, you just mentioned like 3 different churches that have different Old Testament canons.
Yeah.
So like the Old Testament canon technically has never been established.
Settled universally.
Right. So when Protestants are coming to like Catholics and Orthodox and saying like, sola scriptura, like scripture alone, you're like, dude, the canon actually still has not been settled.
Yeah.
Just a note.
Just noted.
Just a little jab.
Noted. Noted. And, well, the other jab, sorry, Protestant friends, the other jab is that the Protestants will go back at Catholics and say, we follow the Hebrew Bible. Mm-hmm. But what we're saying to you is that that's not what the church followed.
Right.
We don't follow the rabbinics because we don't believe what the rabbinics believe.
This was one of the points of contention, actually, is that the Christians were saying, like these texts we've used for how long now?
We've used for 2-3 centuries.
And all of a sudden you're going to back out because it's saying something about the Messiah that you don't like.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I'm
I
paraphrasing.
know, you're being
I'm being mean.
You're getting feisty. You're getting zealous. No, that's the point, is that those things are happening. What else is happening? So the Christians are adopting a lot of the Apocrypha. They're adopting a lot of the pseudepigrapha, right? Mm-hmm. Writings that are coming up. They're adopting Philo.
Yeah.
So Philo of Alexandria is a Jewish philosopher, Platonic philosopher, contemporary to Jesus, widely read, widely known. The only reason we have his large corpus of writings is because the church preserved it, not the rabbis.
Jews. Yeah.
The rabbis rejected Philo.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that? We'll answer that next episode.
Right.
The other thing to note is that the rabbis, we can tell this from rabbinic writings, they did not like people on their own reading Ezekiel chapter 1. They didn't want people studying that chapter. You had to go to your rabbi to ask about that chapter.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't like it. Why? I'll leave it to the audience. Go read chapter 1 of Ezekiel. And then you come to your conclusion why you think the rabbis would push that away.
Yeah. It also, just looking at this from like an anthropological standpoint, when you have the destruction of the temple and Jews are being scattered out of Judea, there's one thing that has to happen in any people group, and it is you have to preserve your ethnic traditions. You have to preserve your ethnicity. And one of the biggest hallmarks of ethnicity is language. Mm-hmm. It's everything. So there's this push.
We understand obviously. We understand.
Oh, yeah.
We understand why the rabbis are doing it. They want to preserve Hebrewism.
Yes.
A lot of these Second Temple texts are Judeo-Greco.
Right. They're Hellenistic.
They're Hellenistic texts.
Yeah. Written in Greek.
So right. I don't want to seem like, why are the rabbis rejecting these? You're right. You're good correction that they're seeing it as, no, that's too Hellenistic. We need to preserve ourselves.
Right.
We got these Hellenists coming at us, destroying our temple, destroying our land, kicking us out of Palestine, the land promised to us. So completely understandable. But the point stands that the rabbis are being very careful with what they're selecting as, no, that this is going to be the canon.
Right.
And Christians are saying, no, this has been part of Judaism for 2, 3, 4, 5 centuries.
Yeah. This has been common to the household. So again, you see, again, when you're studying history, you're looking at change and continuity over time. And especially when the trope is that, Christianity branches off of Judaism. Well, here's a great instance where you're like, well, who's preserving the tradition and who is changing something here, right? And what you see is that this honing in of rabbinicism on their ethnicity is causing them, and also their theology, is causing them to sort of start to put walls around the canon that weren't previously there. Yeah. And the Christians are like, well, wait a second, this has always been common to the house.
Yeah. And so that's the whole point of, when we're talking about parting the ways, we're talking about scholars like Daniel Boyarin, Dr. Daniel Boyarin, who wrote the book Borderlines. Mm-hmm. Okay, the walls are starting to come up 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, but they weren't there that whole time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So walls are starting to be built, but the borderlines are pretty blurry up until, we would argue the 2nd century. He would argue a little further, but
yeah. Okay, the last two things that we see blossom in the 2nd century, again, is this continued growth of the Gentile aspect of the church. It doesn't stop. It just keeps bringing in more and more and more Gentiles. And for Christians, that is what the Old Testament was about all along. But for Judeans, they're starting to hone in on like Torah, their traditions, the traditions of their fathers. The Gentiles are, an unrighteous people, and all these. So you have on the one hand,
and I think proselytism begins to die with the rabbis.
Yeah, it begins to wane.
There is some evidence of evangelization, if you will, maybe.
Yeah, when you're being attacked, you're not going to be focused on spreading your message. You're going to be focused on surviving.
Preservation.
So they're preserving and surviving, while Christians are going out and spreading their message, and so they're bringing in large swaths of Gentiles, and so the face of Christianity continues to develop and change over time. But you have that continued aspect of proselytism that dies down in rabbinicism. Mm-hmm. So that's going to be a point of departure, just culturally speaking. So when they come to talk to each other, now they're really speaking two different languages.
And again, when we're talking about Jews being suppressed and persecuted and all that, that's also a clue to saying the parting of the ways is happening in the 2nd century.
Yeah.
Because Romans are also persecuting Christians, but it's happening separately. Yeah. The Romans know when they're persecuting Jews, right. And the Romans know when they're persecuting Christians.
They're persecuting Christians qua Christians. Yeah. So even the Romans at this point are able to differentiate. Mm-hmm. These are the Jews. These are the Christians.
Mm-hmm. In most of the empire, Rome, happened in the 1st century, but in most of the empire, that's happening. The distinctions are there.
So the final point of parting the ways in the 2nd century is this development of the concept of heresy, where the rabbinics move from a concept of sect to heresy. That blossoms, and we actually do see that, no, you're teaching wrong things.
Yeah. So borders are starting to be built. The development of the term, the concept of heresy, heretical, wrong thinking and wrongdoing. So if you look at the Mishnah, so again, the Mishnah is that great rabbinical commentary, the first piece of literature we have from the rabbis, late 2nd century, early 3rd century. It says at the beginning, it puts 3 borders up. It says, the following have no share in the world to come: one who denies the resurrection of the dead, one who denies that the Torah is from heaven, and an Epicurean. Mm. Okay. So again, none of those mention Christians, but again, we said the benedictions are mentioning Christians. Mm-hmm. Okay. In the Mishnah, it's mentioning those 3 things. So if you don't believe in the resurrection, you're outside the scope now. Mm-hmm. Well, that wasn't the case in the 1st century. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection, and they were inside the scope. They were the priests.
Yeah.
Epicurean, right? If you're an Epicurean, flesh that one out for people.
Yeah. So basically, with Epicureans, is that there's nothing, there's no judgment, that's going to happen. There's nothing like that. So literally the happy life, the good life, the philosopher's life is actually to find happiness and joy and blessedness through pleasure. So it was like hedonism. In a way, it's like a hedonism,
Yeah. So it denies
accountability for actions.
Accountability for actions. Mm. And so what the rabbis are stressing there by saying, if you're an Epicurean, you're out, is that there will be a judgment.
Yeah. So denying the judgment.
Right. Denying the judgment. Yeah. And then the other one was that if you deny that the Torah is from heaven, that has come down from heaven, I'm going to leave that there because we're actually going to get into
We'll pick that one up.
We're going to pick that one up in the next episode. But again, these borders are now coming into Judaism.
By the time you get to the early 3rd century then, so to round this out and to round out this episode, at the beginning of this, we're talking about all this fluidity. Bam, bam, bam. It's like, that doesn't take you away from the common household yet. Yeah. But by the time you get to the early 3rd century, you have even in like some Christian documents the idea that like, well, they have Moses, like we have Christ. And the only way that somebody could say something like that, is if it's like it's over. Like we're giving up.
So those documents are fun. We'll mention them. Those documents are fun because it tells us two things. You could read it as it's over, and they're just saying, the Jews and they didn't accept Jesus, and we got to try and explain that.
Right.
Or you can read it as there are still Jewish believers who are trying to explain why the majority of Jews haven't accepted. So there's still intermingling going on, right? You can read it both ways.
Yeah.
There. Two great texts for you for our listeners to go read, really, that show still intersection happening between Judaism and Judaism, basically Judaism and Judaism, right? Christianity and rabbinic Judaism, or just Judaism in general. The testaments of the patriarchs. So these are documents that can be dated maybe to the late 1st century, but definitely to the 2nd century, perhaps after the Bar Kokhba revolt. Why are they important? So they purport to be the last will and testament of each of the 12 sons, of Jacob. And so every tribe, basically, Dan, Benjamin, Levi, they all have a last will and testament. And these documents are very, very interesting because they could only really have been written by someone who is ethnically Jewish. They still love Torah. It's still clear that they love Torah and they observe Torah. It's still clear that they follow purity laws. They're circumcised. They're Torah observant. But it's like Jesus is kind of sprinkled into these documents as their Messiah. And they're pro-Paul. So they're Torah observant, which Paul would have been iffy, for Gentiles at least, would have been iffy about. Torah observant, pro-St. Paul, and pro-Jesus. That breaks down a lot of categories. Yeah. Right? So those are fun reads. And scholars will tell you that traditionally they were read as, they're so Jewish that they must have been written by 1st century Jews, and then Christians kept them and interpolated and wrote Christ into them. Right. But modern scholars are now saying, no, there's great unity.
There's a unity of thought.
There's unity of thought in these texts. Why are we separating them out? Yeah. Why not look at them as continuous communities who were writing these texts and accepted Jesus as Messiah Jesus. Right. So that breaks down.
So are these Jewish Christian texts?
Right. That should break down all our categories of Jew versus Christian. Okay. And these are 2nd century texts. So we've said there's a parting, but again,
there's still nuance.
There's a nuance to it. Yeah. So go read the Testaments of the Patriarchs. Right. Great documents. The other ones are the Pseudo-Clementine literature. So there's in this body of literature, it's basically two novels, the Homilies and the Recognitions, probably dating to the 4th century, with elements that trace back to the 2nd and 3rd century. Okay, but they're two novels that basically rewrite the history of the Book of Acts, and the story focuses on James and Peter, and the writers of the Pseudo-Clementine literature seem to be Torah observant, but they're actually anti-cultic. But they also, like you said, propose two parallel lines of salvation. They say the Hebrews have Moses, and the Christians have Jesus. And Moses was hidden from the Gentiles, and Jesus was hidden from the Jews. So it's probably a lot of maybe a Jewish Christian community who's trying to navigate the fact that the rabbis have rejected Jesus as Messiah. They're trying to reconcile that and still stay close to their Jewish brethren. Yeah. So again, even well into the 4th century, you're seeing great intersectionality between these two estranged sisters.
Good. So, in the next episode, what we're going to do is focus on one aspect, like we said, of the 2nd century parting story that we think is actually the most significant, and that is the differing concepts, the emergent differing concepts of God, like himself, okay, in his nature. So there's a lot of fruitful territory for further research. Hey, if anybody's out there and they want a free thesis thrown at them,
if you're in a PhD program and you need a thesis,
yeah, you're struggling. So this is fruitful territory for further research. It's to bring together all of these different scholars who've spearheaded all these like really innovative points of research.
Right.
So let's say independent scholar Margaret Barker with temple theology. Okay, that's one.
It'd be great to see people bring these scholars together and talk to each other. Yeah. Margaret Barker is one of them, good one. Peter Schaeffer, Daniel Boyarin, Michael Heiser on the Protestant side.
To say what they did though, so you have Margaret Barker, temple theology. You've got Daniel Boyarin with the Two Powers in Heaven, and
Ellen Siegel
we'll talk about.
Yeah.
Michael Heiser on the Divine Council, which we'll talk about in the next episode. James D.G. Dunn,
is one of the major Parting of the Ways scholars.
Parting of the Ways. And then you have the independent scholar, Dr. Alice Lindsley, who's a biblical anthropologist, who talks
really different take.
Very different take, but talks about Horite Hebrew religion and what it looked like and what its roots were and all those things. So if all of these areas of research could speak to one another...
and they have, and it's that's the point. Is like it's begun.
Started
to happen.
to, yeah. So in the next episode, what we're going to do is kind of let all of those views speak to one another, and then we'll sort of present what we kind of think might be driving, at least at the heart of this Parting of the Ways story.
Yeah.